I think the appeal for this is going to be quite broad. So we'll finish at 12 or just before. If you have any questions or comments throughout, please use the chat box if you can, although I'm aware that most of you can't actually use the chat box. So Menti will be there for you to ask questions in a moment or two. Please keep yourself on mute unless you want to say anything. And as usual, these sessions are informal, but hopefully they are also extremely informative. So before we kick off, just a couple of questions for you. And if you'd like to go to menti.com, and the code for Menti when you get there is 59992174. I think that's quite an easy code today. Let's see where I want to be. Ooh. I think I'm on the wrong picture, but that's fine. Actually, I rather like that as our starting point for the for our Menti question today. Was a lovely scene, and it's a bit like that in Stafford today, apart from the trees. So, oh well, I've got to ask this, haven't I? Have you or haven't you? Will you? Won't you? Where are you at with your Christmas tree? Oh, we already have Christmas trees up and looking beautiful. That's but I see quite a strong sense of this is a little bit too early, isn't it? We're in December. Surely we can do it. But no, say the masses, it's way too early. Still in the loft. I like that. I like that. I have to say that mine is I can see it here. It's gently leaning against the wall in the porch, beautifully clad in cellophane, waiting for me to show some interest in it. Well, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Christmas cake, like it. Well, that thing is, it is definitely the right time, if not too late, for Christmas cake, isn't it? Because they have to mature, don't they? You have to drench them with brandy or something like that, don't you? Anyway, thank you everybody. I'm just going to move this slide on so that, well, we'll do in a second or two, be able to leave questions for Andras, Anna or Rich, but not for Anna because Anna actually isn't here, but Andras and Rich are definitely here. So I am going to now stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to Rich. Welcome.
Thanks, Rachel, and good to see everyone this morning. Rachel, can I just you may need to grant me permission to share my screen. It looks like it's disabled.
I'll be just doing that. I was just going to find your name, unless where are you?
Well, whilst that's doing, I can make a start anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, great to see everyone. So I thought I'd just start before handing over to Andras to talk about PHM ExploreR with just a bit of history in the BNSSG systems, that's Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire system about PHM and where this all came from, really, from our side. So it was way back actually in about 2017 that I first heard PHM and risk strat and segmentation, and there's a lot of noise about at that point that we should be doing it and should be segmenting, stratifying and everything. At that point we only had secondary care data, so we were very limited to the sus data in what we could do. So I'm just going to bring up now where is it now? Here. So can you see this on the screen here?
Yep.
Yep. So this is our urgent care population. So all we were able to do is look at, as I've highlighted there at the top, the total activity, some of A&E attendance and non-elective. So that's kind of what our target variable we're looking for discrimination in. And the only variables we had to work with was age, sex, and IMD, because we were able to get that from the SUS data set. And of course, we only had the population who had A&E attendances and non-elective admissions. We didn't have all of those that didn't really. Well, we were able to pull some of the data from the spine and then look at those who were in the SUS and those who weren't. Anyway, it was very primitive, you know, it was extremely limited by what we could do with low amounts of data. But nonetheless, this type of analysis where we'd segment and show the differences in non-elective utilisation of healthcare got people thinking, and it built familiarity. And on the back of that, we were able to get some money to get a pilot study done where we brought together 5 GP practices worth of primary care data and secondary care data. And then that was linked primary and secondary care data, which enabled us to then look at things like this. So this was a paper I did back right at the start of January 2019 there. So just looked at, again, our urgent care population, but this time had the primary care variables. And the primary care variables, the attributes, the characteristics of the patient, socioeconomic, clinical, chronic conditions, etc., gives so much insight. So we're able to, we first of all made the finding that the highest use 1% of the population consume the same value of urgent care resources as the remaining 99%. So this gained a lot of traction in our system, the 1%. Who are this 1% was the question asked. So we were able to say that with the data. We were able to say, well, this is the 1% and this is the 99%. This is the age profiles, the frailty scores, other conditions there, you know, the various chronic conditions, to gain a bit of an understanding about who they were. And also we're able to look at patients within those 1% as well, and actually found a lot of heterogeneity within that quite small cohort where resource use would still be poles apart for some people in the lower or upper ends of that 1% segment. This also, we wrote some of the analysis up to compare segmentation methods here. So here this is a publication we did where we looked at our population, some descriptive stats there, and then we compared side by side a number of different segmentation methods, decision trees, clustering, etc., bridges to health, and looked at the pros and the cons of which settings you might want to use different segmentation methods. This led to more investment in our linked data resource in the system here in BNSSG. So on the back of that, I'm building again that familiarity, showing people how useful this could be. We were able to secure buy-in and investment to creating the BNSSG system-wide data set. So this brought together 1 million for all of our 1 million population primary care data, secondary care data, mental health community data. And since we went live with that in August 2019, we've now brought in 111 data, 909 data, and social care data, all at record level. Now, so that's kind of where we've come in BNSSG, and we're doing all sorts of analytics on using this data set now. It's often the first port of call for a lot of the work we do. Now, the PHM ExploreR kind of came from this in a way. Actually, what we did when we started doing some segmentation of risk strat and all sorts of other stuff through this data set, we thought, well, actually, why don't we do a workshop at the NHSR conference? Are these all showing coming up, by the way, aren't they? The different screens here. This was great, and frankly, the work we've done here in PHM ExploreR wouldn't have happened without the NHSR conference, and I look forward to when we can meet in person again, hopefully next year, because it was I mean, it's been great online, but it's you know, the real things are a lot easier to, you know, network and get stuff across to people. So we run a workshop there, a worked introduction to population segmentation and PHM analytics, and that went down fairly well. We did a little survey after that workshop and asked some questions in that survey around would people benefit from some open source kind of tool or a place where you can do PHM all in one place, basically. And the overwhelming response to that survey for the participants at the workshop was yes, this would be valuable. And kind of no surprise really, because at that time and even now there's very few tools that exist that do all of this all in one go, that can be used by analysts, by clinicians, and so on. And certainly not any free ones. You know, a lot of the consultancies were trying to sell stuff, but it was often, you know, a one-off bespoke exercise rather than a tool that can be used and reused and adjusted, etc. Over time. So we thought, right, there's a demand to do this. We then saw the Health Foundation had made some funding available in their Advancing Analytics, Applied Analytics Award. So we thought we'd go for it. And kind of that's the kind of backstory then to how where we've ended up with this project. So yeah, I'll hand over to Andras then, who's going to now talk about the actual tool itself. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's not quite finished yet. We've still got a number of months, yes, left in this project, we're really, it might not be perfect. We're really grateful for any feedback you can provide, positive or negative. Ideally, well, not negative,
Definitely.
but constructive feedback on how we can better it.
Yeah.
And we'll take it from there in the remaining months of the project.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Rich. Andras.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Rich. I am also going to open up with the slideshow. Hopefully people aren't too bored of looking at these just yet. Given that Rich has already talked quite a bit about how we are looking at PHM, I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. The first thing that I want to talk about is that we do want to thank the Health Foundation who actually funded this project under the Advancing Applied Analytics Award. Obviously, without them, it wouldn't have been necessarily possible to actually go ahead and make this. The main aim that we've put behind the ExploreR is that anyone who has an interest in PHM, we want them to be able to actually look at their population, from that population, identify a segment or a cohort that they want to do some work with, and then do some data visualization in-house using some of our open source software, which we are hoping is customizable enough to suit at least a couple of people. The first thing that I'm actually going to talk through is the data that we use in the ExploreR. We are currently using linked data that Rich has already mentioned. We use two tables, the first of which is attributes, the second is activity. The attributes table has one patient for each row, where we start with an ID from the left, and then going across the rows, we have all of the various clinical and demographic attributes that we might want about an individual, whether that's their age, sex, what clinical conditions they have, etc. We prefix each of the headings with either demog or clinic just to tell the ExploreR which category these variables belong to. The kind of minimum data requirement that we need for the ExploreR is some information so the minimum information about each patient is their sex, age, ethnicity, what deprivation they live in, at least one geographical field, so that could be the practice that they belong to, their locality, their PCN, etc. And at least one clinical condition, ideally, of course, more. So that could be whether someone has asthma, has hypertension, etc. The activity table has a point of activity in our system per row rather than one patient. So there are far more rows in this table than the previous one, as some individuals can have dozens or even hundreds in the system. So a point of activity is really any time that the individual is actually seen by the health service. So that could be them visiting their GP, getting a prescription, being admitted to A&E, really any activity that's notable that they have. This table is first of all classified by points of delivery, or just POD for short, which we generally just use as character classifiers to try and sort the activity roughly by type. So we could be looking at primary and secondary, and then within each of those categories we can have, for primary care, we could have GP, nurse, etc. Just so that we can actually classify the activity a little bit more finely. We also need the arrival date, the departure date, and the specialty of the activity in question, as well as the cost for some of the aggregation that we do. That is enough for the presentation. I'm just going to quickly switch over to the actual ExploreR. I do just want to preface this by saying that if people do have questions, we should hopefully have 5 to 10 minutes at the end to ask them. Although if something very urgent does come up, then please do let me know, and I will do my best to answer kind of on the fly. But otherwise, I'm just going to walk through, roughly speaking, how we envision the use of the ExploreR, and then we can get back to them at the end. So this is the landing page that we get. Generally, this will look a little bit different if you haven't loaded in any data, which is exactly what I'm going to start with. So if you want to upload data to the ExploreR, assuming that you formatted the data that I just talked about, your attributes and activity table, into the format that I described, you would simply click the button in the first page. You would select your files. So in this case, I've already got my attributes file selected. I can then also select my activity. Oh, that's the wrong thing. Wait a moment, just while it checks that the headers are actually what we want. And then we basically just pointed the ExploreR to actually pick up, to try and find some of these fields that I just talked about. So pointing it to the age, sex, the index of multiple deprivation, and so on and so on. You also have to select of your clinical conditions, which ones are long-term conditions, and of them, which ones are considered simple or more complex to handle. You also include vital determinants, and assuming that you are interested in using it, the bridge is to have segments where you basically select which field belongs in each of the categories, and then you specify which values to include in each of these segments. I'm not really going to talk too much about this because this part is optional, but we do understand that bridges to have is a fairly commonly used tool, which is why we've decided to include it. Anyway, pressing the Go button here will aggregate some of these numbers and then land you back at the landing page. The first step for the ExploreR really is to actually select the segment of the population that you're interested in working with. In this case, I have only got 10,000 individuals, so I'm not going to come up with a particularly complicated definition. But if I click the new analysis dataset button, this will let me actually define what segment of my population I'm interested in. The way that this page works is that you basically have these statements of what value for each individual, you select their attributes, and then you specify for what values of the attribute in question you would like to include them. You can add multiple fields using and or state, joining them by and or, which means that you can actually come up with some fairly complicated definitions if you just keep on adding them. So for example, for our mental health cohort, I'm given to understanding that at the BNSRG we use about 5 different fields where we just go through anything related and we just join them with an or, and then we just take all the adults. In this example, I'm just going to select all of those because ideally I would like to have as many people as possible to actually do my subsequent analysis with. The criteria to be an adult is that I just need age to be at least 18. So I'm going to select age as my field. I'm going to select greater than or equals, and then I'm going to enter 18 here. So hopefully when I click this button, it will tell me that it's found a number of people according to my criteria. Then return to the landing page, I can select adult from this dropdown. You can see that adult covers 8,060 individuals, whereas the entire population itself covers 10,000. So that's roughly speaking what we'd expect. Regardless, once I have it selected, I can then just click go and actually get into the tool proper. This then puts us onto the navigation page. We don't really intend for the ExploreR to be a linear program. Really, you can jump to any part of it that you are interested in, completely ignore some. So if you only want to actually look at segmentation or theoplots, you can just ignore all of the others. Regardless, just for today, I am going to go through it, starting at the top and then working my way downwards, just so that I cover as many of the pages as possible. Code identification is basically just a way of further subsetting the dataset that I've got. So I've currently got the adult segment of my population. Just as an easy example, what I'm going to do is select everyone with hypertension. So I'm going to name this hypertension. I'm then going to go ahead and find the hypertension field in my data. One in my data means that the individual has a condition. So I'm going to go ahead and grab everyone who has hypertension, which is about 1,308 people. Previously, where I was subsetting the entire data set, this doesn't actually remove anyone. It just means that later on I can refer back to this field and basically compare people with or without hypertension. This is a fairly trivial example because really you could just actually use the field to do this, but for the sake of argument, let's pretend that this is something a little bit more exciting. The next section is descriptive summaries, which pretty much as the name suggests, once it loads, basically just provides a couple of key graphs about the population, whether that's looking at the demographic overview, the multimorbidity, or some brief summaries about the activity and the costs by points of delivery. On each page, there are a number of options for how you would like to actually look at the population. So the first one that I've got here is a population pyramid, fairly standard, splitting people into 5-year age bands. I can select from the, I have a number of options. So from here, I can select multimorbidity, deprivation, ICP, ethnicity, bridges to health segments, or hypertension, which is the core that I just came up with earlier. So if I select it, you can see that this will show me what proportion of my population has this field. I can also produce separate pyramids for people who have hypertension here on the right, or people who don't here on the left. You can see that we got roughly what we'd expect, which is that far fewer people have hypertension than do. On each page, there are a couple of slightly different options sometimes that you can play around with. So here on the clinical page, you can either look at the multimorbidity by the population percentage or total, or the spend or the activity. You can also select a number of clinical conditions just to see what their prevalence is overall in the population. On activity, you can inspect the spend either in total or per capita, a little bit similar to these options, but using a different chart. This time you can specify what you want on your y-axis, whether that's multimorbidity. So these are pretty much the same options that we've already shown before. But this time you can also look at it in a little bit more detail by points of delivery. I briefly mentioned points of delivery, so this goes back to how we classify our data. In my case, I've got 111, community, mental health, primary care contact, secondary, and total. So basically, this just shows me an aggregation of the spend per. This just basically tells me the spend per capita with respect to my multimorbidity counts across all of my points of delivery. Just a little also touching a little bit on what Rich talked about earlier, that about 1% of the population uses almost as much in terms of resource as the remaining 99. We've also got a Lorentz curve here at the bottom that can actually be used to show this. So we can see that just if you hover over it, you can see that 99% of the population uses 73% of the spending. So we do just have this phenomenon where a very small percent of the population uses far more than the average of everyone else. I'm not really going to click through the other pages here just because they are fairly similar to what we talked about, just a couple of bar charts, only this time rather than looking at multimorbidity, we're looking at deprivation or our geographical fields or the wider determinants that we have in our data. Instead, what I'm going to do is move on to segmentation. For segmentation, we've included 4 methods. Obviously, there are many different ways of actually segmenting a population. This is just something that we thought would be fairly sensible to include and to look at. Our first 2 methods are basically prescribed binning, basically work by prescribed binning criteria, which is to say that we specify what individuals we want in each segment, and then we just simply drop people into bins which defined by those segments. So the first one is just a very simple matrix where you can segment your people, where you can segment people by age and by complexity or multimorbidity, whatever you want to call it. So if I wanted, say, everyone from, so because I've only got adults, this would look in terms of children, adults, and elderly. So this would give us a 3x3 matrix. Obviously, I've removed children, so I'm just going to up this to say 40, and then run the graphing again. But this is basically just a really simple way of specifying what your age bounds are, what your multimorbidity count is, and then this will just give you some numbers in terms of how many people actually fit into that group, what the total spend is within that group, and the spend per person yearly is. This is just a fairly intuitive graph. The second prescribed binning is bridges to health, which I am going to go out on a limb and guess that a large number of people have heard of. There are just some options for actually how you would like to break down your population. So obviously this is the entire adult population that we've got selected here. We got 34% in the chronic conditions. I can then further split this by the fields that I've already mentioned briefly, whether that's multimorbidity or ethnicity. I'm just going to select ethnicity, and then this will. Sorry, I just heard a noise. So this will then, so we can just kind of break down the population by a given field and then further segment each of these bars by the bridges to health conditions. You may have noticed that sometimes I've got these graphs at the bottom. These are fairly constant across all of our segmentation pages. We've got a tree map and a pie chart showing either the number of individuals, the total cost, or the activity titled with each of the segments name, just so that we have the same method for actually comparing how these different segmentation methods break down a population. And then at the top, we have something that's a little bit more dedicated to each of these methods. So here we've had this matrix. Here in bridges to health, we've got these bars. Moving on to decision trees. In addition to our prescribed binning criteria, what we thought would be really good to do is to get some data-driven techniques in the ExploreR so that we can actually look at it, so that rather than specifying the criteria for each of our bins previously, we can actually try and look at it from some different perspectives and use a little bit of machine learning. The way that decision trees work is very simple. You just select what attributes you're interested in actually using to do the segmenting. You then select a target variable. You specify a name. There are also a couple of options for controlling the algorithm itself that I'm not going to touch on because they're not strictly relevant. Then when you press go, it will produce a tree for you as well as a segmentation that we have on every, as well as the graphs that we have on every segmentation page, where you can see that our population is broken down into, in this case, we have 8 groups, where most of the population ends up in this group here and this group here. And then we've got a couple of small groups where the total cost is much higher than elsewhere. So you can see that this first segment here is, I think, what might be our healthy category from our adults, and then we've got a couple of small ones where people are fairly expensive. But you can tell that this time the segmentation has been done in terms of total cost. This is returning a little bit back to some of the previous work that my colleagues have done at the BNSSG. They've looked at different segmentation methods and concluded that classification and regression trees is actually one of the best algorithms to use when we want to do some. So it is one of the best methods to use in terms of total spend when we're looking at the discrimination that is between each of these different groups. Anyway, so you get your tree. You can take this to actually show you the rules in case you do want to use this as prescribed binning criteria later on. This tree is fairly simple. And it is worth mentioning that the fields that are produced by this are actually added to the list of variables. So you can see that here at the bottom, we have card segments, which we got by running this, so that we do have these segments 1 through 8 actually added to the data that we have running in the background. K-means clustering is fairly similar, only this time we don't actually specify a target variable. We instead just let the K-means algorithm find us our groups. We do have the same options here. I'm not going to run it purely because I think people already have an idea of what it's going to look like. The next section is theoplots or theographs. I'm not sure if you are familiar with them. They are essentially a patient-level graph that shows all of the activity that a given individual has had in the system. We've also got some information about them. We've also got some information about their attributes, but effectively what happens is that here on the left, you can specify the date range of when you would like to look at the activity. In my case, in this specific case, we are looking from November 2019 to up until about a couple of months ago. We can then select the criteria for how we would like to sample this individual. In this specific case, we can basically select, say, multimorbidity. If I don't really care who I'm getting, I can just select everyone and then press go. And then this will produce me this graph here on the right, where going along the x-axis is the date, and then these points on the graph actually represent our point of activity where the system has seen the individual. We can tell that they've had a couple of secondary outpatient appointments and that they've been seen in primary contact a couple of times. We also get some information about their attributes, which might actually help us give some context into the activity that is going on here. The other theoplot option we have is the group theoplot, where rather than having this where we only have a single individual, what we actually do is compress multiple people onto the same graph so that we can actually compare their activity to see if they've had a different pathway going through the system. This is especially interesting is if you have a very specific cohort that you actually want to look at, rather than just currently doing what I'm doing, which is just randomly sampling everyone that's an adult. So if you have a very specific cohort with just a couple dozen to a couple hundred individuals, this could be useful to actually just plot them all on a single graph and then compare their particular type of their activity just to see how they differ. So what happens on this graph is that we have the same options as before of selecting date. This time we specify the number of individuals, but then we do also just select a variable and we decide how we want to sample these individuals. We also have to select the activity types that we are interested in including. This is once again going back to the point of delivery classifications that we got earlier, as well as whatever colors we want to plot them in. And then this will give us a patient, a row. So this will then plot us, in this case, 11 rows, because it's found 11 people out of the 20 with activity. 9 didn't have any, so they're just not being plotted. And then it will plot the same points of activity that we've selected in the colors that we've specified. You can hover over it to see a little bit more detail. But the idea is that if you select a very specific type of activity, you can see how individuals within your cohort have had a different experience within that particular pathway. Yeah, so you can see that number 4 here has had quite a bit of mental health activity. 6 had a little bit, and most of the others have only really been seen as secondary because it's only mental health and secondary activity that I've actually selected. I am going to now move on to the last page, which is risk stratification. This is quite probably the page that we're still working the most on. In broad terms, the idea behind this page is that we fit a combination of logistic and linear regression models to the attributes that we select. And then based on that, first of all, try and come up with a model to actually describe the activity usage within us for our people. And then based on that, stratify the individuals into 10 groups where one set where we kind of range from individuals least likely to incur costs or to have activity in the system to those who we are most certain will be. So the way that this works, you may have seen these drops down. I've shown you these drops down before, but basically you just select what attributes you would like to actually use to what attributes you would like to use in your what attributes you would like to use to try and predict your activity. There are currently 3 options in terms of what you would like to predict. But that's the likelihood of activity. So what's the probability that someone, based on their previous year of activity, is going to be seen again by our system? The expected activity count and the expected costs that they are likely to incur. Of course, all of these, the activity and the activity, the likelihood of activity, expected activity, and expected costs are aggregated over the activity types that we select here. At the moment, I've got everything selected, so that will correspond to an individual being seen by any of these points of delivery. I could untick some of these to say only leave in mental health, which would then give me the probability that an individual is going to be seen by our mental health services. I am going to just really quickly set this to expected costs, and I'm going to take everything for just to demonstrate what happens when I run the algorithm with everything ticked. Just because I don't really have a very specific question lined up. What then happens in the background is that a logistic regression is used to, first of all, calculate the probability that someone is going to have activity, and then those who are expected to have activity would then be used to train a linear regression model to then actually try and produce the risk groups that I mentioned earlier. So you can see here that we've got a table which gives us the expected costs by group. So you can see that we've got, so group 1, 2, and 3 here on the graph, judging by expected costs. You can see that basically we don't expect to see them in our system at all, whereas group 10 is going to be our highest expected cost, and that this kind of just rises as we move through the groups. I think I'm going to just pause here for a moment. Would it be possible to ask you to check if we've had any questions pop up on Menti?
Yeah,
Rachel,
sure.
please?
Of course. And I know they have. So I can either read them, but it's probably easier for me to share my screen. So you
Maybe,
can.
yes. So first of all, before we move into questions, I do just want to thank everyone for bearing with me. I realize that this has been very quickly, me going through it, and I didn't really explain things in detail, but I'm afraid that I did just want to get through this as quickly as possible due to time constraints. So thank you very much for.
No. Thank you very much for going through that with us, Andras. And what you're saying is that you want to come back, but you want more time. Well, that's fantastic. So I'll take you up on that, and we'll get that sorted. Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Once questions are over, I do have a slide just to talk through where you can actually find the current files for the ExploreR and my email address if anyone wants to get in touch. But if you want to share the screen and get through some of the questions
Brilliant.
first,
that's great. Okay, let's see what we've got. Okay. So you can see, can you see the screen now, Andras?
Yes, I can.
So you can pick and choose. You can go top left, or you can go for the big one in the middle. Do you want to just pick pick questions that you want to talk to?
I'm going to just start from the left. Any plans to bring invited determinants data to your integrated data set? This has already been done. I did briefly touch on vital determinants. I just didn't really talk about it, I'm afraid, because I thought it might be a bit more interesting to talk about the other things. So we do already have vital determinants data. It is another requirement really that we do want to include that comes along with deprivation.
So what is your source of information for the wider determinants? How are you sort of gathering that data?
I think it's using the index of multiple deprivation, that's
Sure.
And the SRs used.
Andras, I can answer this one as well. So the 3 local authorities that make up BNSSG, which is B Bristol, NS North Somerset, and SG South Gloucestershire, they all publicly report wider determinants such as things like educational attainment, air quality, proportion of green spaces, per square mile or whatever. All of that kind of stuff is publicly reported. Now it is at ward level. So what we've done in BNSSG, we've basically appended to that matching on the ward, basically the LSOA, the lower super output area. So even though it is down as an individual attribute, so in the attributes table here, the wider determinants are there for each individual. They are kind of proxies because that is the wider determinant for that LSOA for which that patient lives in. So it's not truly an individual attribute.
No, that makes perfect sense. And in some cases that will be the attribute for the ward that the LSOA is part of as well.
Exactly.
So you take whatever information you can get, don't you?
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
For these variables, yes.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for that response. That's great. Okay. Andras, what else would you want to talk to?
Do you see the PHM ExploreR primarily as a tool for managers, clinicians, or as a tool for analysts? The answer for this is both. At the moment, what we are aiming to do is simultaneously get it out to clinicians and GPs who are obviously working with our PHM, who are working in PHM, but we're also looking to try and get some of our analysts involved so that rather than spending time going to our databases and trying to type in SQL, if there are some simpler questions, then they can just simply load up the tool and then try and get that done. So I think the answer is anyone who is actually looking to do a little bit of segmentation, we are hoping to get in, whether that's clinicians or analysts. Are you using any separate validation set for the forecasting model? I can't see the bottom of that question. But the answer is that at the moment, thank you very much. So I am just going through the left column, I suppose. At the moment, we are still very much working. That is, as I mentioned, the page that we're still working the most on. At the moment, we don't really use any separate validation. And in terms of overfitting, well, the main difficulty we've had is that the data was widely skewed by individuals who didn't really have much activity. So what we are basically doing is excluding them during the phase of actually predicting for the people. So when we're actually predicting the expected values, we only train that model on the individuals who have had activity, and we effectively assign very low to 0 to those who haven't been seen in the system, unless there is good reason to expect otherwise. So we effectively multiply the probability of seeing them with the expected amount, which means that anyone who has a very small probability is just going to get a very small expected amount and is going to end up in one of the lower risk groups. Could I ask you to check, Rachel, could I ask you to check how many questions we have in this left column, just if I'm going to go through them all?
Okay, well, I have a suggestion. Could you just
Yeah.
go through the ones that you can see in the
Yeah,
other
yeah.
columns? And the reason is because if you're asking me to do something as specific as saying what questions are, you're exposing my inadequacy with this tool.
I do apologize. I will.
No, it's absolutely fine.
On the screen then.
The scrolling thing has a mind of its own, basically, and I can't necessarily control it. It doesn't respond as quickly as I would like. So if you could just say, go to the ones that you can see, and then I'll discover what other ones there are afterwards if we've got time. I don't think we'll have time for everything, but let's see how we get on.
But I'm going to get through as many as possible. So how do you communicate the outputs from the tool to decision makers? Is it being used to inform decision making? At the moment, we are aiming to effectively put the, so maybe it's different in other systems. At the moment, we have a group who effectively makes some of these decisions, and we have been looking at just straight up giving them access to the tool, and because there are clinicians involved, we are hoping that they can actually just use it to just straight up inform their decisions based on whatever questions they may have. Is there a user guide available or in the pipeline? Would be super useful for other folks who need to pick this up. That is a very good point. Thank you for raising it. It had slipped my mind earlier. It is something that I'm currently working on, and I will be including. I'm currently trying to put together effectively a slide deck for each page, just to talk through how to click through and what options are available, as well as just how to set up the data and how to load it into the tool. But it is a work in progress. Who are you aiming this product at? That part I've already answered the question. And have you seen changes in policy with it? We haven't really seen changes in policy. We've actually had a little bit of trouble with our information governance. We're generally trying to get it out to the wider system because effectively within the CCG, we can't share it with any clinician who, according to our current data sharing agreement, we can share it with anyone within our local network within the CCG who is interested. But if there is anyone outside, say from our providers, it in a slightly odd way, we can't actually share it with them. So if a GP wanted to look at their own data, I wouldn't be allowed to give it to them, which is a little weird. So we haven't really seen many changes.
So you'll see I've moved it up a little bit.
Yes, thank you very much. The tool and the analytical output looks great, relies on linked data. Our local IG advisors tell us we shouldn't be linking data even to anonymize. How have you overcome this barrier? This is mostly, so this has, we've already had the linked data by the time that we started this project, so this hasn't really been a barrier for us. I'm not sure if Richard has any comments on this, but I think roughly speaking, I don't really have many comments on this, given that it's happened before my time, so to speak.
It's everyone seems to be struggling with these issues, and yeah, we're no exception to that. We've got in a good enough place with our system-wide data set that I referred to at the beginning, and Andras, I think, mentioned in the previous question some of the issues around getting the tool out to the wider system, the CCGs, the GPs, and some of the providers. I think we are able to, with IG clearance, get this tool out to with full functionality. but it's a perennial issue, really. I mean, in terms of linking data at source, that should be fine. We're doing that. Others are doing that. Many of us are doing that. You know, you just need the data processing agreements and sharing agreements and the DPIAs and all of that in place. But yeah, it's possible. I mean, in terms of local IG advisors, you know, some I can't speak for all of them, but you know, some I've seen there's a balance between risk and reward, isn't it? Whenever you share data, there's always a risk, but it's whether the reward of sharing it for the use trumps that risk. And often with IG, it seems that they only see one side of that equation. They just see the risk and not always the reward. So it's difficult sometimes to get through to them the balance. And you know, one of the Caldecott principles, I can't remember which one, talks about that duty to share information, the risk of not sharing the information in terms of the opportunity cost of not doing the linkage and generating the insight. Yeah.
I'm not sure how much more time we have, but I did just want to get in and answer 2 more questions here on the top left that talk about the dummy data set. So the data that I was using to actually showcase the tool is a dummy data set that we've made, which is why we have a very nice around 10,000 individuals in it. It is up on our GitHub along with the tool. It is completely open source for anyone to download. So yeah, so for anyone who would like to just download it with the dummy data set, you can do that. And I will at some point get a link out to you. I might ask Rachel to just send it out along with my email after this meeting.
No problem.
I think that might be the simplest. Am I still good to keep answering questions?
Yeah, sure.
Or...
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So is the coding and approach open to the NHS? I'm not sure what the coding and approach necessarily means in this context. If you just mean the actual code itself, that is freely available and anyone can take it. As little or as much of it as you would like. I'm afraid, so if an acute hospital has, yes, that question. I'm afraid I don't know what EPR system like Epic is. I'm not familiar with it, so I might need a little bit more context to answer it, I'm afraid.
Okay. Don't know if anybody wanted to. I'm probably not the person to expand on that. If anybody wanted to, someone's got their hand up. This is exciting. I love this. I've just got to find them now. Sarah, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. That was my question.
Excellent.
So EPR is electronic patient record system, and Epic is this big American hospital system that's supposed to be able to generate loads of information and data and etc. And I just wondered if you can get hold of that kind of data to use in your tool.
I can take this one, Andras, if you
Yeah,
want. Yeah. I mean, basically, the Andras mentioned at the beginning, I think, in the slides, the data set format. So basically, the tool is just looking for an activity table and an attribute table, and it's expecting that the activity table will have certain columns. So the pod column, the point of delivery, the specialty, any cost information. So basically, really what anyone using the tool has to do, including us, is map whatever data exists in a PAS system, EPR system, whatever it is from the trust or from SUS data, you know, from central down for NHS Digital, etc. Just basically map that data into those half dozen or so columns, and then that's it basically. So as long as if your data set is already in a kind of contact level, so each row in your data set is a contact, is an admission, an outpatient, A&E attendance or whatever, as a GP consultation, a mental health contact or whatever it is, then that makes it incredibly easy, because then you basically just taking that and mapping some of the fields across, deleting probably many of the columns with diagnosis codes, HRG codes, etc., and just getting to the kind of core information that the tool requires, which, as I say, is that kind of pod specialty, cost, etc. info. So that kind of would take place outside the tool. So the tool's looking for those tables with those column headers. So that's why we provide kind of the dummy data set. So before people go through that effort, and it's not a huge amount of effort necessarily. They can actually use the dummy data set to play with the tool to work out whether it's something that they would like to use. And then if they are happy with that, then it's a bit of work, as I say, just to kind of map those existing data sets as it exists in whichever system to those two tables that the Explorer then.
So when you say a bit of work, I mean sort of how much?
Well, we actually did something the other day. So we've in this tool so far, up until about 3-4 days ago, we didn't have social care data in there. So we just had the primary care, the secondary care, 111, some of the data that mentioned earlier. And a question came to us from one of our execs around some social care question, basically. And we thought, great, we'll go straight to the ExploreR. But the ExploreR didn't at that point it had all of a system-wide data set apart from social care data. So because it's not quite mapped in to our system-wide data set yet. So it was probably about an hour, Andras, an hour or two, to basically map the social care data, because it existed in a way that each row within that was an event or an activity. So you just rename a couple of the columns, get rid of a lot of them, so that you map basically your point of delivery level 1 will be social care, your point of delivery level 2 will be then we were looking at section 117 reviews, so that we just entered that in as a mapping in there. We didn't have any costs, so that went down as null. And the specialty was that a review had been completed, which we could just then map from that data set. So it's you know, I mean, in terms of like, you know, R and the standard dplyr R stuff and all of that, you know, it's not a big deal to get from your source data to the data in the right format for this.
Thank you.
There are a couple more questions that I've exposed, but I'm just reading Peter's comments, so I'm being very rude. Yes, it is great to see people from outside the Midlands on the call.
So back to questions.
Yeah.
How much of the development time was set aside for testing the tool? Does it work? And suitability of the interface for different users. I'm not sure quite what you mean by does it work. In principle, if the data is in the format that we've just described, which I will admit that getting it into that specific format is a little finicky, and the specifically the data loading part can a little bit be a little bit awkward. But beyond that, I think, Rich, we found it to be fairly stable by now. So that's been good for me. As for the suitability of the interface for different users, I think that varies based on the user. I'm afraid, so I think the little bit of feedback that we've had recently is that kind of just comes back around to user guides, which is to say that some people just need a little bit more hand-holding them to be widely released. So I think the specific question we've had come up was what exactly is deprivation, which it's not exactly strictly related to R2, but kind of just tells me that I think I do need to, in great detail, actually come up with a guide and continuously refine it until almost everyone is happy with everything and it's clear to understand. Artist Nomad, INC 10 codes, etc. used to define the course and the attributes running the tool. Rich, I think you're going to have to come in because I'm afraid I'm not familiar with SNOMAD IC 10 codes.
Yeah.
In principle, the cohorts in the tool comes from the attributes data that you uploaded. Basically, we just take the column names and use them to actually do our definitions. So assuming that you can get the data into the format that we just discussed, the cohorts and the attributes will come from that.
So the tool looks for in the activity data set, a column called specialty. And for that, we've used treatment function code, I believe, Andras, for secondary care data from SUS. Equally, you could use ICD-10 or whatever other codes. But basically, that specialty is then used for showing the data in particular ways. When you hover over the field blocks, for instance, it displays the specialty of that activity you're hovering over. So there's room for one specialty field. So we've basically mapped that to be treatment function code for SUS data, the reason for the appointment for GP data, the nature of, you know, etc. But there's flexibility. It's down to how you want to map the data you've got and what you want to pull through as that specialty for that particular type of data, primary care, secondary care. In terms of the cohort, there's a function on the tool to basically read in to define a cohort rather than go through the ands and the ors and all of that stuff, especially if HRG and ICD-10 etc. are not on that activity table anyway. What we do for that case, just a simple SQL query somewhere else to output the cohort of interest in terms of the NHS numbers. So there you could do your own SQL query with ICD-10 codes, procedure codes, HRGs, etc., whatever you want to do, define a cohort of a few hundred IDs or whatever it is. And then there's a functionality to import that the cohort IDs. And then when they're imported, then as Andras was showing through the kind of global groups within the tool, then that becomes something that you can then start filtering by. So you basically kind of can do it manually, define your cohort, and then just upload it into a tool.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks very much, Rich. Actually, Andras, when you said I'll leave that one to Rich, I thought you said Rach. I was about to launch into something then. No, that's great. We've just tipped over the 12 o'clock mark. So you're honoured actually, because normally I just shut the door. It's just like I'm out of here. So it's been absolutely brilliant, and thank you so much for sharing the tool with us. And we've had a lot of interest here, and there's plenty more questions that we haven't got round to answering, which I'll probably share with you later. We'll share with you later. So let's continue the conversation. We'll feed back to you. I've got some ideas and definitely got some more questions, but I didn't want to force those in today, as there's plenty of others. So thanks again for coming. Brilliant. And I'll follow up with everybody with a couple of questions that we've had in the chat, as well as those on Menti. So thank you very much. I'll see you again soon. Okay, bye. Great. Everybody.
Thank you very much for the invite.
Thanks, Rich.
No problem. See you in a couple of weeks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.